The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone streets of Athens as Socrates walked slowly through the agora. His bare feet made soft sounds against the worn marble beneath him. At 70 years old, his body moved with the careful steps of age, but his dark eyes remained sharp and curious. Today would be different from all the other days he had spent in this marketplace. Today he would face a trial that could end his life. The agora buzzed with its usual energy. Merchants called out their prices for olives and pottery. Children ran between the stalls, their laughter mixing with the voices of haggling customers. Socrates had walked these same paths for decades, stopping anyone who would listen to talk about life, truth, and what it meant to be a good person. But now, many of those same people would sit in judgment of him. He paused near the fountain, where water trickled from the mouth of a stone lion. A young man approached him, someone he had questioned many times before. The youth looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his tunic. "Teacher, are you afraid of what will happen today?" the young man asked. Socrates smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "Fear is an interesting thing, my friend. Tell me, what should I be afraid of? Death, of course. They say you might be sentenced to die." "Ah, but do we know what death is? How can we fear something we do not understand? Death might be the greatest blessing of all, or it might be nothing at all. Without knowledge, fear becomes foolish." The young man shifted uncomfortably. This was how conversations with Socrates always went. He never gave simple answers. Instead, he asked questions that made people think harder than they wanted to. "But surely you must feel something about today," the youth pressed. Socrates sat down on the edge of the fountain. "I feel curious. I have spent my life trying to understand what makes a person good and wise. Today, I will see if the people of Athens value the search for truth, or if they prefer comfortable lies." As they talked, more people gathered around them. Word had spread quickly through the city about the trial. Some came to support Socrates, others to see the man who had made them question their beliefs. A few came with anger in their hearts, convinced that this strange philosopher had corrupted their sons and insulted their gods. An older merchant, his beard gray with age, spoke up from the crowd. "Socrates, you have spent years making us look foolish with your questions. You claim to know nothing, yet you act as if you are wiser than all of us. What gives you the right?" Socrates looked at the merchant with genuine interest. "My friend, you speak of rights and wisdom. These are important matters. Tell me, what makes someone wise? A wise person knows many things. They understand business, politics, and the proper way to honor the gods." "I see, and you believe you possess this wisdom?" "I know enough to run a successful business and provide for my family." "That is admirable. But tell me, do you know why justice is good? You understand what makes an action right or wrong? You know what happens to the soul after death?" The merchant's face reddened. "These are questions for priests and philosophers, not for working men. But should not every person know how to live well? If we do not examine our lives, how can we be certain we are living correctly?" This was the heart of everything Socrates believed. He had spent his life convinced that most people lived without thinking deeply about their actions or beliefs. They followed customs and traditions without asking why those customs existed. They pursued wealth and power without asking whether these things truly brought happiness. The crowd murmured among themselves. Some nodded in agreement with Socrates, others looked annoyed. A woman in a fine dress stepped forward. "You speak of examining our lives, but what good has your examination brought you? You are poor, your wife complains about you, and now you face trial. How is this the result of wisdom?" Socrates laughed, a sound full of genuine amusement. "You make excellent points, dear lady. Perhaps you can help me understand something. What is the purpose of life? Is it to gather wealth and avoid trouble? Any sensible person would say yes. But consider this. If a person lives a long life filled with riches, but never knows whether they are good or evil, never understands the difference between right and wrong, never grasps what makes life meaningful, have they truly lived at all? Or have they simply existed, like a plant that grows but never thinks?" The woman frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "You make simple things complicated. Or perhaps we have made complicated things too simple. Tell me, would you rather live 100 years in ignorance, or 10 years with true understanding?" Before she could answer, a voice called out from the edge of the crowd. "Socrates of Athens, It is time. The court official stood waiting, his face stern and official. The moment had come for Socrates to face his accusers. The crowd began to disperse, some following toward the courthouse, others returning to their daily business. As Socrates stood to leave, the young man who had first approached him grabbed his arm. "Teacher, what if they find you guilty? What if they sentence you to death?" Socrates placed a gentle hand on the youth's shoulder. "Then I will have lived as I believed a person should live, and I will die as I believe a person should die. I have never believed that a good person can be truly harmed by a bad person. The only real harm comes from becoming bad ourselves. But what about your family, your friends? What about all the people who still need to learn from you, my young friend? If my life has taught anything worthwhile, then my death may teach something as well. Sometimes the most important lesson is seeing someone choose truth over comfort, principle over safety." They walked together toward the courthouse, joining the stream of Athenians heading to witness the trial. Some came for entertainment, others for justice, and still others to see history unfold. Few understood that they were about to witness something that would echo through the centuries. As they approached the large stone building where the trial would take place, Socrates looked back at the agora one last time. For decades he had wandered these streets like a gadfly, stinging the lazy horse of Athenian society into wakefulness. He had questioned generals about courage, politicians about justice, and priests about piety. He had never claimed to have answers, only better questions. Now Athens would decide whether they wanted to keep their gadfly or crush it. Either way, Socrates had already won his most important victory. He had lived an examined life, and he had helped others examine theirs. The great doors of the courthouse loomed before him, but Socrates felt no fear. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every question he had asked, every assumption he had challenged, every comfortable belief he had disturbed had led to this trial. As he stepped through the doors, ready to face whatever judgment awaited him, Socrates carried with him the most dangerous idea in human history. The people should think for themselves, question everything, and never stop seeking truth no matter what the cost. The trial of Socrates was about to begin, but the real trial had been going on for 70 years. It was the trial of whether human beings could handle the responsibility of thinking freely, and whether society could tolerate those who insisted on asking uncomfortable questions. The answer to that trial would determine not just the fate of one old philosopher, but the future of human thought itself. Inside the courthouse, Socrates sat quietly on a wooden bench, waiting for his trial to begin. The building hummed with voices as 500 Athenian citizens filed in to serve as his jury. As he watched them take their seats, memories of his beloved Athens flooded his mind. He remembered the Athens of his youth, when the city sparkled like a jewel in the Mediterranean sun. That was 50 years ago, when Pericles ruled and Athens was the envy of the world. The great statesman had transformed their city into something magnificent. New temples rose from the Acropolis, their white marble columns reaching toward the sky. The most skilled artists, writers, and thinkers from across the Greek world came to Athens to share their ideas. Socrates closed his eyes and could almost see young Pericles standing before the assembled citizens, his voice ringing with pride. "Our city is the school of all Greece," Pericles had declared. "We are a democracy, and every citizen has a voice in how we are governed." Those had been golden days. The harbor was filled with ships bringing goods from Egypt, grain from the Black Sea, and silver from the mines of Laurion. The agora bustled with merchants from distant lands. Philosophers debated in the shade of the plane trees. Poets recited their latest works to eager crowds. But even then, Socrates had asked uncomfortable questions. He remembered approaching Pericles himself one day, when the great leader was surrounded by admirers. "Tell me, Pericles," young Socrates had said, "you speak of democracy as if it is always good. But what if the people make bad decisions? What if they vote for something that is wrong?" Pericles had smiled confidently. "The wisdom of many is greater than the wisdom of one. The people will choose correctly, but how can we be sure? Do the people always know what is best for themselves?" The great statesman had frowned slightly. "You ask strange questions, young man. Democracy is the finest form of government ever created. I do not doubt that it may be. But should we not examine even our finest beliefs to make sure they are true?" That conversation had stayed with Socrates for decades. Now, as he sat waiting to be judged by 500 of his fellow citizens, He wondered if Pericles had been right about the wisdom of the many. The Golden Age had not lasted. Socrates remembered the day when news arrived that Sparta had declared war on Athens. The Peloponnesian War, they called it, because it drew in city-states from across the Peloponnese Peninsula. What had begun as a conflict between two powerful cities became a disaster that tore apart the Greek world. For 27 long years, Athens and Sparta had fought. Socrates had served as a soldier in that war, marching with his fellow citizens to battles at Patadia, Amphipolis, and Dilium. He had seen good men die in muddy fields far from home. He had watched the war slowly drain the life from his beloved city. The war had changed Athens in ways that went deeper than the loss of ships and soldiers. Fear crept into the hearts of the citizens. They began to suspect their neighbors of being spies. They questioned the loyalty of anyone who thought differently. The open, curious spirit that had made Athens great began to wither. Socrates remembered the terrible plague that had swept through the city during the war. Bodies piled up in the streets. Families were destroyed. Even Pericles himself had died from the disease. The Athens that emerged from the plague was harder, more suspicious, less willing to trust in bold new ideas. Then came the darkest period of all. Near the end of the war, when Athens was weak and desperate, a group of 30 men had seized power. They called themselves the 30 Tyrants, and they ruled through fear and violence. Democracy disappeared overnight. Anyone who opposed them was killed or driven into exile. Socrates had lived through those dark months when soldiers patrolled the streets and citizens whispered in corners. He had seen how quickly a free people could lose their freedom. The tyrants had even tried to force him to participate in their crimes, ordering him to arrest an innocent man. Socrates had refused and gone home, prepared to die rather than become part of their evil. Fortunately, the tyrants had been overthrown after only 8 months. Democracy had returned to Athens, but it was a wounded democracy, full of anger and mistrust. The restored democratic government had executed many of the tyrants and their supporters. The city had tasted blood and found it bitter. In this new Athens, people looked for someone to blame for their troubles. They remembered the old Athens, when life had been easier and hope had seemed eternal. They wanted to return to that golden time, but they did not understand that the world had changed forever. Some blamed the philosophers and teachers for corrupting the traditional ways. Others blamed the gods for abandoning the city. Still others blamed democracy itself for being too weak to protect them. Fear made people angry, and anger made them look for enemies. Socrates had watched all of this unfold with growing sadness. He had seen how suffering could make people cruel, how defeat could make them suspicious, how change could make them desperate to return to an imagined past. The Athens of his youth had been confident enough to welcome new ideas and foreign visitors. This Athens was afraid of anything that challenged old beliefs. The irony was not lost on him. Athens called itself the birthplace of democracy, the city where every citizen could speak freely. Yet here he sat, about to be tried for the crime of asking questions and encouraging others to think for themselves. The same democracy that had once celebrated open debate now seemed to fear it. As Socrates looked at the jurors filing into their seats, he recognized many faces. There was the potter whose understanding of justice he had questioned. There was the merchant who had grown angry when Socrates suggested that wealth did not guarantee wisdom. There was the young politician who had been embarrassed when he could not explain what made a law good or bad. These were not evil men. They were ordinary citizens who had lived through extraordinary times. They had seen their city defeated in war, their democracy overthrown by tyrants, their traditional beliefs challenged by new ideas. They were scared and confused, looking for someone to blame for their troubles. Socrates understood their fear, but he also understood something else. The Athens he had grown up in had been destroyed not by foreign armies or internal tyrants, but by the refusal to ask hard questions. They had stopped examining their beliefs and their actions. They had become so confident in their ways that they had stopped learning and growing. The real tragedy was not that Athens had fallen from its golden age, but that it had learned the wrong lessons from its fall. Instead of becoming more thoughtful and self-aware, it had become more closed and defensive. Instead of seeking wisdom, it sought comfort and familiar prejudices. As the last juror took his seat and the trial prepared to begin, Socrates felt a deep sadness for his city. Athens had given birth to democracy and philosophy, but now it seemed afraid of both. The city that had once been the teacher of Greece was now afraid of teachers. The charges against him were serious, but Socrates knew that he was really being tried for something much deeper. He was being tried for insisting that people should think for themselves, that they should question their leaders and their traditions, that they should never stop seeking truth. In a way, the trial was a test of everything Athens claimed to believe about itself. Would the birthplace of democracy remember that democracy required citizens who could think clearly and question boldly, or would fear win over wisdom once again? The answer would determine not just his fate, but the future of human thought itself. The chief magistrate stood up and called for order in the courthouse. His voice echoed off the stone walls as he read the formal charges against Socrates. The philosopher listened carefully, but his mind drifted to the story of his own life, wondering how the son of a simple sculptor had come to this moment. Socrates had been born in Athens 70 years ago, when the city was just beginning to discover its greatness. His father, Socrates, worked with his hands, carving beautiful statues from blocks of cold marble. Every morning, young Socrates would watch his father chip away at the stone, slowly revealing the figure that was hidden inside. "How do you know what to carve, father?" the boy had asked one day. Socrates had smiled and wiped the marbled dust from his hands. "The statue is already there, my son. I just have to remove everything that does not belong." Those words had stayed with Socrates his entire life. Later, when he began his own work of helping people discover truth, he would remember his father's lesson. Truth was already there, hidden inside people's minds. He just had to help them remove everything that did not belong. His mother, Phanarit, was a midwife who helped bring babies into the world. She would disappear for hours, sometimes days, when women in the neighborhood went into labor. When she returned, she would be tired but happy, carrying news of new life. "Why do you work so hard for others, mother?" young Socrates had asked. "Because bringing new life into the world is the most important work there is," she had answered. "I help mothers deliver their babies safely. Without help, both mother and child might die." Years later, Socrates would call himself a midwife too. But instead of helping deliver babies, he helped people deliver their own ideas. He would ask questions and probe gently until people gave birth to thoughts they never knew they had. As a young man, Socrates had been strong and healthy. He had served Athens as a soldier, fighting in 3 major battles during the long war with Sparta. At Patadia, he had saved the life of young Alcibiades, who would later become one of Athens' most famous generals. At Dilium, when the Athenian army was defeated and soldiers were running for their lives, Socrates had walked calmly from the battlefield, his steady courage protecting his retreating comrades. But it was at Amphipolis that something had changed inside him. During a long, cold winter siege, when food was scarce and men were dying of hunger and disease, Socrates had begun to ask himself deeper questions. What was the point of fighting? What made one cause worth dying for and another not? What did it mean to be brave, and what did it mean to be good? Other soldiers complained about the cold, the hunger, and the endless waiting. Socrates seemed unaffected by physical hardship. He would stand barefoot in the snow, thinking deeply about something no one else could see. His fellow soldiers began to think he was strange, but they respected his courage and his willingness to share his food with anyone who needed it. When he returned to Athens after the war, Socrates was a different man. He had seen enough of death and suffering to know that most of the things people worried about were not really important. He had also begun to hear something he called his inner voice, a divine sign that would warn him when he was about to make a mistake. It was around this time that his friend Chaerephon had gone to the oracle at Delphi with a question about Socrates. The oracle was the most sacred place in Greece, where the god Apollo spoke through a priestess to answer questions about the future. Chaerephon had asked the oracle who was the wisest man in Athens. The oracle's answer had shocked everyone. No one is wiser than Socrates. When Chaerephon brought this news back to Athens, Socrates was confused and troubled. He knew that he was not wise. In fact, the more he learned, the more he realized how little he actually knew. How could the oracle say he was the wisest man in Athens? Determined to understand the oracle's meaning, Socrates had begun visiting the people who were supposed to be wise. He talked to politicians who claimed to know how to govern, questioned poets who said they understood beauty and truth. He interviewed craftsmen who boasted of their skills. What he discovered amazed him. The politicians could not explain what made a law good or bad. The poets could not say what made one poem better than another. Even the craftsmen, who actually knew how to make things, could not explain why their methods worked. But the most surprising discovery was that none of these people realized how little they actually knew. They all thought they were wise, but they could not answer simple questions about their own areas of expertise. Slowly, Socrates began to understand what the oracle meant. He was the wisest man in Athens, not because he knew more than others, but because he alone knew that he did not know. While others lived in the false confidence of imagined wisdom, Socrates lived in the true humility of acknowledged ignorance. This realization changed his life completely. He began to see himself as having a divine mission to wake up the people of Athens to their own ignorance. Like a gadfly that stings a lazy horse into action, he would sting the lazy minds of his fellow citizens into thought. He married Xantippe, a woman known for her sharp tongue and quick temper. They had 3 sons together, but Socrates spent little time at home. His real family was the city of Athens, and his real work was in the agora, questioning anyone who would listen. Xantippe often complained about his neglect of family responsibilities. "How can you spend all day talking to strangers about wisdom when your own children need food and clothing?" she would demand. Socrates would listen patiently to her complaints, then gently ask, "My dear wife, what is more important? That our sons have full bellies, or that they learn to think clearly about right and wrong?" "Both," she would shout. "A good father provides both." She was right, of course, but Socrates believed that his mission was bigger than one family. If he could help Athens become more thoughtful and wise, all the children of the city would benefit. Still, he knew that his choice caused pain to those who loved him. As the years passed, Socrates gathered a circle of young followers who were fascinated by his method of questioning. Among them was Plato, a brilliant young man from a noble family who would later become one of the greatest philosophers in history. There was also Xenophon, a practical soldier who would write down many of Socrates' conversations for future generations. But Socrates also made enemies. Many of the powerful men he questioned grew angry when he exposed their ignorance in front of others. Parents blamed him when their sons came home asking uncomfortable questions about family beliefs and traditions. The situation grew worse when some of his former students became involved in politics in ways that brought shame to Athens. Alcibiades, whose life Socrates had saved in battle, later betrayed Athens and helped their enemies. Critias became one of the feared 30 tyrants, who had ruled Athens with brutal cruelty. People began to whisper that Socrates was corrupting the youth of Athens. They said he was teaching young men to disrespect their elders and question the gods. They forgot that Socrates had refused to participate in the crimes of the 30 tyrants, that he had always urged people to be more virtuous, not less. As Socrates sat in the courthouse, listening to the charges against him, he reflected on the strange path his life had taken. He had begun as the son of a sculptor and a midwife, learned courage as a soldier, and discovered his mission through the words of the oracle. He had spent his life trying to help people become better and wiser, but now he was accused of making them worse. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had insisted that no one does wrong willingly was now accused of deliberately corrupting the youth. The man who had argued that virtue was the highest good was now said to be promoting vice. The man who had always honored his divine calling was now charged with impiety toward the gods. But Socrates felt no bitterness toward his accusers. They were doing what they thought was right, just as he had always done what he thought was right. The difference was that he had spent his life examining his beliefs and questioning his assumptions, while they had not. As the trial prepared to begin in earnest, Socrates wondered if his life's work had been worth it. Had he made Athens better or worse? Had his questions led people toward wisdom or away from it? Had he served the gods faithfully or betrayed them? He did not know the answers to these questions, but he knew something more important. He had lived an examined life, and he had encouraged others to do the same. Whatever happened next, he could face it with the knowledge that he had been true to his deepest beliefs. The sculptor's son was ready to face his final test. The trial had officially begun. Meletus, a young poet with an angry face, stood before the 500 jurors to present his case against Socrates. His voice was loud and confident as he read the charges. "Citizens of Athens, this man Socrates corrupts our youth and refuses to believe in the gods of our city. He teaches young men to question everything sacred and turns them against their families and traditions." The jurors listened carefully. Many nodded in agreement. They had heard these accusations whispered in the agora for months. Now they would finally hear the truth. When Meletus finished reading the charges, the chief magistrate called for Socrates to respond. The old philosopher stood slowly, his simple cloak wrapped around his thin frame. He looked at the jurors with calm, curious eyes, as if he were about to begin one of his usual conversations in the marketplace. "Citizens of Athens," Socrates began, "I must ask you to listen carefully to what I say. I will speak to you in the same way I have always spoken, asking questions and seeking truth. If this seems strange in a courtroom, remember that I am 70 years old and this is my first time on trial. I know no other way to speak." Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. They had expected a formal legal defense, not a conversation. Socrates turned to face Meletus directly. "Young man, you say I corrupt the youth. This is a serious charge. Tell me who makes the youth better." Meletus looked confused by the question. "What do you mean?" "It is simple. You say, I make young people worse. But someone must make them better. Who does this good work? The laws make them better. Good laws create good citizens. But laws are just words on stone tablets. Who teaches the young people to follow these laws? The judges and magistrates, of course." "I see. So all the judges and magistrates of Athens make young people better?" "Yes, that is right. What about the members of the assembly, the citizens who vote on laws? Do they also improve the youth?" "Certainly. All good citizens help make the youth better." Socrates paused and smiled gently. "So let me understand your claim. You say that every person in Athens except me makes the youth better, and I alone make them worse. Is this what you believe?" The absurdity of the statement was clear to everyone. Meletus had painted himself into a corner. If everyone except Socrates improved young people, then why were there so many problems with the youth of Athens? "Think about horses," Socrates continued. "When someone wants to improve a horse, do they ask just anyone to train it? Or do they find someone with special knowledge and skill? Is it not true that most people would harm a horse if they tried to train it, and only a few experts can actually help it?" Several jurors nodded. This made perfect sense. So if this is true for horses, why would it be different for human beings? Should we not expect that only a few people have the knowledge to truly improve young minds, while most people, through ignorance, might actually harm them? Meletus was growing red in the face. "You twist words, Socrates. Everyone knows you corrupt the youth. But my friend, you have not answered my question. You claim I make young people worse. But tell me, do I do this on purpose or by accident?" "On purpose, obviously. You know what you are doing." "Ah, so you believe I deliberately make the youth worse. But this creates a puzzle. Tell me, is it better to live among good people or bad people?" "Good people, naturally. Do bad people sometimes harm those around them?" "Yes. So if I make young people bad on purpose, and bad people harm those around them, then I would be harming myself. Does this make sense? Would a person deliberately surround himself with people who might hurt him?" Meletus struggled to answer. The logic was clear. No reasonable person would intentionally create enemies who might harm them. "Perhaps," Socrates suggested gently, "if I do make young people worse, I do it by accident, without meaning to. In that case, you should teach me privately what I am doing wrong, not bring me to court. After all, we do not punish people for honest mistakes, do we?" The crowd was beginning to murmur. Socrates had taken apart the first charge with simple questions and clear thinking. Even those who disliked him had to admit his reasoning was sound. But Meletus was not finished. "You also refuse to believe in the gods of Athens. You introduce new spiritual beings that our city does not recognize." "This is interesting," Socrates replied. "You say I do not believe in the gods, but you also say I introduce new spiritual beings. Help me understand this. Do you believe that someone can believe in spiritual things without believing in spirits?" "What do you mean?" "Well, can a person believe in human activities without believing in humans? Can someone believe in horse activities without believing in horses? No, that would be impossible. Then if I believe in spiritual activities as you claim, must I not also believe in spiritual beings?" "Yes, I suppose so." "And are not spiritual beings either gods or the children of gods?" Meletus nodded reluctantly. "So according to your own words, I do believe in spiritual beings, which means I believe in gods or the children of gods. How then can you say I do not believe in gods at all?" Again, Meletus had been caught in a contradiction. He was claiming that Socrates both believed and did not believe in divine beings at the same time. One of the jurors, an older man with gray hair, raised his hand to speak. Socrates, your questions are clever, but you have not answered the real concern. Many parents complain that their sons come home from talking with you and suddenly question everything their families believe. They argue with their fathers and disrespect their elders. How do you explain this? Socrates turned to address the juror directly. So you raise an important point. Tell me, what is more valuable to a young person? To believe something because his father tells him to, or to believe it because he understands why it is true? Respect for elders is important, the juror replied. I agree completely. But let me ask you this. If a father teaches the son that stealing is wrong, is it better for the son to avoid stealing because he fears punishment, or because he understands that stealing harms others and damages his own character? The juror thought for a moment. I suppose understanding is better. And how does a person gain understanding? Is it not by asking questions, examining ideas, and thinking carefully about what is true and what is false? Yes, but young people ask too many questions. They should trust their elders. But sir, should elders not want their children to have strong reasons for their beliefs? If a belief is true and good, will it not become stronger when examined? And if a belief is false or harmful, should we not want our children to discover this? The juror looked uncomfortable. You make it sound simple, but families are falling apart. Sons no longer obey their fathers. I understand your concern, Socrates said with genuine sympathy. But tell me, what kind of obedience is more valuable? The obedience of a slave who follows orders without thinking, or the obedience of a free person who chooses to do right because he understands what right means? Free obedience, I suppose. Then should we not teach young people to think clearly about right and wrong, so that when they choose to obey, they do it from wisdom rather than fear? The juror sat back, clearly wrestling with these ideas. Around the courtroom, other jurors were whispering among themselves. Socrates was not giving them simple answers. Instead, he was making them think about questions they had never considered before. Another juror spoke up. Socrates, you claim to be wise, but you also say you know nothing. Which is it? Socrates smiled. You have identified something very important. I do claim to know one thing. I know that I do not know. Most people think they know things they do not actually know. I am wiser than they are only because I understand my own ignorance. But how can ignorance be wisdom? Consider this example. Imagine two men are lost in a forest. One man thinks he knows the way out, but he is wrong. He walks confidently in the wrong direction, getting more lost with every step. The other man admits he does not know the way. Which man is more likely to find the correct path? It's the man who admits he is lost. Exactly. The man who knows he is lost will look for landmarks, ask for directions, and think carefully about each step. The man who thinks he knows the way will march blindly toward danger. This is why knowing that we do not know is the beginning of true knowledge. As Socrates continued to speak and answer questions, something remarkable was happening in the courtroom. The angry, suspicious mood that had filled the room was slowly changing. Jurors who had come expecting to hear the defense of a dangerous criminal were instead witnessing something they had never seen before, a man who truly lived what he taught. Socrates was not just talking about the importance of asking questions and examining beliefs. He was demonstrating it right there in front of them. Every answer he gave led to new questions. Every question he asked revealed assumptions that had never been examined. Some jurors were beginning to understand why young people were drawn to this strange old man. He did not give them easy answers or tell them what to think. Instead, he showed them how to think, treated them as intelligent human beings, capable of discovering truth for themselves. But others were growing more uncomfortable. If Socrates was right about the importance of questioning everything, then they had been living their entire lives without really thinking about what they believed or why they believed it. This was a disturbing idea. The trial was far from over, but already it was clear that something more than one man's fate was being decided. The future of Athens itself hung in the balance. Would they choose the comfort of unexamined beliefs, or would they embrace the difficult but necessary work of seeking truth? The art of sacred questioning was on trial, and the verdict would echo through history. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows of the courthouse as Socrates prepared to give his main defense. The questioning of Miletus had shown the weakness of the charges, but now he needed to explain his life and his mission to the people of Athens. The 500 jurors watched him carefully, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. "Citizens of Athens," Socrates began, "I must tell you why I have lived as I have, and why I cannot change my ways, even if you ask me to." He walked slowly before the jury, his voice calm and steady. "Many of you have heard that the oracle at Delphi called me the wisest man in Athens. This puzzled me greatly because I knew that I was not wise at all. So I decided to test the oracle's words by visiting those who were supposed to be wise." Several jurors leaned forward. They had heard this story before, but never from Socrates himself. "I went first to a politician who is famous for his wisdom. I asked him simple questions about justice and good government. To my surprise, he could not answer them. He became angry and told me I was wasting his time with foolish questions. Then I visited a famous poet. I asked him to explain what his poems meant and why they were beautiful. He told me that his words came from divine inspiration, but he could not explain their meaning. When I asked other people about his poems, I found that they understood them better than the poet himself. Finally, I spoke with skilled craftsmen. These men knew their trades well. A shoemaker could explain how to make good shoes. A carpenter could tell you how to build a strong house. But when I asked them about justice, courage, or the meaning of life, they were as confused as everyone else. Worse, because they were skilled in their crafts, they thought they were wise about everything." Socrates paused and looked directly at the jurors. "This is when I began to understand the oracle's meaning. I am the wisest man in Athens, not because I know more than others, but because I alone know that I know nothing. While others live in false confidence, I live in honest ignorance." A young juror called out, "But Socrates, if you know nothing, how can you teach anyone anything?" "An excellent question," Socrates replied with a smile. "Let me tell you about my method. I do not teach in the way other teachers do. I do not fill empty minds with facts. Instead, I help people discover what they already know deep inside themselves. My mother was a midwife who helped women give birth to their babies. I am also a midwife, but I help people give birth to their own ideas. I ask questions that make them think. I challenge their assumptions. I help them examine their beliefs until the truth emerges. For example, everyone says they want to be good. But what does it mean to be good? Is a good person someone who never breaks the law? What if the law is unjust? Is a good person someone who always tells the truth? What if the truth will hurt an innocent person? These questions have no easy answers, but thinking about them makes us wiser." An older juror, a merchant by his clothing, spoke up. "Socrates, you speak of examining our lives, but what has this examination brought you? You are poor, your family struggles, and now you face death. How is this the result of wisdom?" You raise an important point, my friend. Most people measure success by wealth, power, and reputation. But I believe these things are not truly valuable. Let me ask you this. Which is more important? To seem good or to be good? To be good, obviously. Which is more important, to have a healthy body or a healthy soul? The merchant hesitated. Both are important, but if you had to choose between them, which would you pick? Would you rather live a long life as a bad person or a short life as a good person? I suppose I would rather be good. Then you understand my choice. I have spent my life caring for my soul rather than my body, seeking wisdom rather than wealth, pursuing truth rather than popularity. I may be poor in money, but I am rich in understanding. But what about your family? Another juror asked. What about your duty to provide for your wife and children? Socrates' expression grew serious. This question troubles me deeply. I love my family, and I know my choices have caused them hardship. Tell me, what is the best gift a father can give his children? Is it gold and silver, or is it the example of how to live a good life? If I teach my sons to pursue wealth above all else, and they become rich but dishonest, have I helped them or harmed them? If I show them how to seek truth and live with courage, and they become poor but virtuous, have I failed them or succeeded? I believe the most important thing I can give my children is the knowledge that virtue is more valuable than any material possession. This is a lesson I can only teach by living it myself. The courtroom was very quiet now. Even those who disagreed with Socrates could see that he truly believed what he was saying. His life matched his words in a way that was rare among men. Some of you may wonder, Socrates continued, why I continue this work when it brings me so much trouble. Why do I not simply be quiet and live a peaceful life? The answer is that I believe I have a divine mission, that God has placed me in Athens like a gadfly on a lazy horse. My job is to sting the city into wakefulness, to make people think about how they are living. Athens is a great city, but greatness can make people lazy. When life is comfortable, we stop asking hard questions. We stop examining our beliefs. We stop growing and learning. This is dangerous for any city, but especially for a democracy. In a democracy, the people rule themselves. But how can people rule wisely if they do not think clearly about what is right and wrong? How can citizens make good decisions if they never examine their own prejudices and assumptions? This is why I cannot stop my work, even if you ask me to. If you offered to free me on the condition that I stop asking questions and stop encouraging others to think, I would have to refuse. I would say to you, citizens of Athens, I love and honor you, but I must obey the God rather than you. As long as I have breath in my body, I will never stop seeking wisdom and encouraging others to do the same. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Some jurors were moved by his words, others were angry. Few looked troubled, as if they were wrestling with ideas they had never considered before. You asked me to defend myself against the charge of corrupting the youth, Socrates said, but I say to you that I have spent my life trying to help young people become better, not worse. I've taught them to think for themselves, to question what they are told, and to seek truth above comfort. If this is corruption, then I am guilty. But I believe it is education. I believe it is what every young person needs to become a good citizen and a good human being. Some of you may think that death would be a terrible punishment for me, but I am not afraid of death. How can I fear something I do not understand? Death is either a dreamless sleep, which would be peaceful, or it is a journey to another place where I could meet and question the great heroes and thinkers of the past. Imagine being able to ask Achilles about true courage, or Homer about the meaning of his stories, or the great lawgivers about justice. If death offers such opportunities, it would be the greatest blessing possible. What I do fear is living without purpose, accepting injustice, or betraying the mission that God has given me. These would be true tragedies, far worse than death. As Socrates finished his defense, the courtroom was completely silent. He had not begged for mercy or tried to win sympathy. Instead, he had challenged the jurors to think about the most important questions of human life. Some jurors were beginning to understand that they were not just judging one old man, but deciding what kind of city Athens would be. Would they be a place where people could ask hard questions and seek truth, even when it was uncomfortable? Or would they choose the safety of unexamined beliefs and traditional answers? The paradox of Socrates was complete. The man who claimed to know nothing had demonstrated more wisdom than all his accusers combined. The man who owned nothing had shown himself richer than the wealthiest citizen. The man who faced death had proven himself more alive than those who sought only comfort and security. The vote would come soon, and with it, the answer to whether Athens valued wisdom enough to protect those who sought it, even when their seeking disturbed the peace of those who preferred not to think. The fate of philosophy itself hung in the balance, waiting for 500 ordinary citizens to decide whether extraordinary questions deserved protection or punishment. The voting was over. The jurors had cast their bronze tokens into 2 urns, one for guilty and one for innocent. The chief magistrate counted the tokens carefully while the courtroom waited in tense silence. When he finished, his voice rang out clearly across the stone chamber. The court finds Socrates guilty of the charges against him by a vote of 280 to 220. A gasp went through the crowd. The margin was closer than many had expected, but the verdict was final. Socrates showed no emotion as he heard the words that condemned him. He had prepared for this moment for years. In the back of the courtroom, a young man with dark hair and intelligent eyes felt tears streaming down his face. Plato had followed his teacher for several years, listening to every conversation, watching every demonstration of the questioning method. Now he saw his mentor facing death for the crime of seeking truth. Next to Plato sat Xenophon, a practical soldier who had learned to love philosophy through Socrates' patient teaching. His face was hard with anger at the injustice, but his eyes showed the deep sadness of losing a friend and guide. Near them, other students of Socrates gathered in small groups, whispering urgently among themselves. There was Antisthenes, whose rough appearance hid a sharp mind devoted to finding the simplest path to virtue. Aristippus sat quietly, his fine clothes marking him as a man of wealth who had chosen wisdom over comfort. Euclid had traveled from Megara just to hear his teacher's defense. These men represented something new in the world. They were not just students learning facts or skills. They were disciples of a way of thinking, followers of a method that put questions above answers and truth above popularity. As the court moved to the second phase of the trial, where punishments would be proposed, the students of Socrates began to realize something important. Their teacher might die, but his ideas would live on through them. Each of them had learned not just what Socrates thought, but how he thought. They had absorbed his method of questioning, his commitment to virtue, and his courage in the face of opposition. The magistrate called for Meletus to propose a punishment. The young poet stood with obvious satisfaction. "Citizens of Athens, this man has corrupted our youth and insulted our gods. For such crimes there can be only one punishment: death." The word echoed through the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Death, the final silencing of the most curious mind in Athens. Now it was Socrates' turn to propose an alternative punishment. According to Athenian law, he could suggest a lighter sentence, and the jury would choose between the two options. Most defendants used this opportunity to beg for mercy, to promise exile or payment of a large fine. Socrates stood slowly and faced the jurors with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the trial. "Citizens of Athens, you asked me to propose my own punishment, but I must ask you, what does a man deserve who has spent his life serving the city by making its citizens wiser and more virtuous?" Several jurors shifted uncomfortably. This was not the humble plea for mercy they had expected. "I believe such a man deserves to be honored, not punished. I propose that instead of death, I should be given free meals in the Prytaneum for the rest of my life." Just like the Olympic champions who bring glory to our city, the courtroom erupted in angry shouts. Even some of Socrates' supporters were shocked by his boldness. Here was a man facing death, and instead of begging for his life, he was asking for rewards. But Plato understood what his teacher was doing. Socrates was refusing to compromise his principles, even to save his life. He would not pretend that seeking wisdom was a crime worthy of punishment. He would not validate the court's decision by proposing his own penalty. After the noise died down, Socrates continued more seriously. "I see that my first proposal disturbs you. Let me be more practical. Some of my friends have suggested that I pay a fine. I am a poor man, but I could probably afford 1 mina of silver." His friends frantically gestured to him from the crowd. Plato stood up and called out, "Teacher, we will guarantee 30 minas on your behalf." Socrates nodded to his loyal students. "Very well. I propose a fine of 30 minas, guaranteed by my friends here, who are willing to pledge their own wealth for my freedom." The jurors now had their choice: death or a fine of 30 minas. It should have been an easy decision. 30 minas was a substantial sum that would hurt Socrates and his friends financially, while allowing him to live. But Socrates' earlier words had angered many of the jurors. His refusal to show proper humility, his suggestion that he deserved honors instead of punishment, his stubborn insistence that his life's work had been good for Athens, all of this struck them as arrogant and unrepentant. The second vote was swift and decisive. By an even larger margin than before, the jury chose death. As the final verdict was announced, something remarkable happened among Socrates' students. Instead of despair, they felt a strange kind of inspiration. Their teacher had shown them how to face the worst that life could offer with dignity and principle intact. Plato looked around at his fellow students and saw the same realization in their eyes. Socrates had given them something more valuable than his physical presence. He had given them a way of thinking that could never be killed by hemlock poison or any other weapon. Antisthenes was already thinking about how to carry on his teacher's work among the poor and common people of Athens. He would strip away all unnecessary luxuries and possessions, living simply while pursuing virtue above all else. His followers would later be called cynics, meaning dog-like. Because of their simple lifestyle and their willingness to challenge social conventions, Aristippus had different plans. He would take Socrates' teachings about the good life and explore what it meant to live well. He believed that pleasure, properly understood, was the highest good, but it must be pleasure guided by wisdom rather than mere impulse. His school would be called the Cyrenaics, and they would influence later thinkers about ethics and happiness. But it was young Plato who would have the greatest impact. As he watched his teacher face death with such courage, Plato was already planning something unprecedented. He would create a school, a permanent institution where Socrates' method could be preserved and developed. He would write down the conversations he had witnessed, turning his teacher's spoken words into immortal literature. More than that, Plato was beginning to see how Socrates' simple questions pointed toward deeper truths about reality itself. If people could be mistaken about what they thought they knew, if the physical world was less reliable than the world of ideas, if truth existed somewhere beyond the changing appearances of daily life, then perhaps there was another realm entirely where perfect justice, beauty, and goodness could be found. Xenophon had his own mission forming in his mind. He would write down the practical wisdom of Socrates, showing how his teacher's ideas could guide real people through real problems. His accounts would be more historical and less philosophical than Plato's, but they would help preserve the memory of Socrates as a man, not just as a symbol. As the trial ended and people began to file out of the courthouse, the students of Socrates gathered around their teacher one last time, before he was taken to prison to await his execution. His face was peaceful, even cheerful. "My friends," he said to them, "do not grieve for me. I have lived as I believed a man should live, and I will die as I believe a man should die. But you must carry on the work we have begun together." "How can we do that without you?" Plato asked, his voice tight with emotion. "You already know how. Ask questions. Examine your beliefs. Seek truth even when it is uncomfortable. Help others to think for themselves. Live virtuously regardless of what others may say or do, but who will listen to us? We are not famous like you." Socrates smiled. "Truth does not need fame to survive. It only needs people willing to seek it and share it. Each of you will find your own way to continue this work. Some will teach in schools, others will write books, still others will simply live as examples of what we have discussed." As the guards came to take Socrates away, he had one final message for his disciples. "Remember this day not as the end of our philosophy, but as its true beginning. When people see that ideas can be more powerful than armies, that truth can survive the death of those who speak it, that wisdom can grow even stronger. When it is opposed, then they will understand what we have really been doing here." The students watched as their teacher was led away, walking with the same steady pace he had used in the agora, asking questions even of his guards. They did not know it yet, but they were witnessing the birth of something that would change the world forever. The death of Socrates would make his ideas immortal. His questions would echo through the centuries, inspiring new generations of thinkers, teachers, and seekers of truth. The trial that was meant to silence one troublesome philosopher would instead ensure that his voice would never be silenced. The seeds of immortal ideas had been planted in the minds of his students. Soon those seeds would grow into mighty trees that would shelter countless future generations in their search for wisdom and truth. 30 days had passed since the trial. Socrates was dead, having drunk the poisoned hemlock in his prison cell, surrounded by his weeping friends. His body was buried, but something strange was happening across Athens and beyond. Instead of ending with his death, talk about Socrates and his ideas was growing stronger. In a small building near the Academy Gymnasium, Plato sat at a wooden table, writing carefully on a papyrus scroll. Around him, other students of Socrates gathered daily to share memories and discuss what their teacher had meant. But Plato was doing something more. He was creating something that had never existed before. Permanent records of philosophical conversations. "I want people 100 years from now to hear Socrates asking his questions," Plato explained to Xenophon, who was working on his own simpler accounts of their teacher's life. "His body's gone, but his method must live forever." As Plato wrote, he began to see deeper meanings in what Socrates had taught. The old philosopher's simple questions about virtue and knowledge pointed toward bigger truths about the nature of reality itself. If the physical world was constantly changing but truth was eternal, then perhaps there was another realm where perfect ideas existed, unchanged and unchanging. Plato's Academy would become the first university in history, attracting students from across the Mediterranean world. For nearly 1,000 years, philosophers would study there, developing and expanding on the foundation that Socrates had laid with his questions. But the influence of Socrates spread far beyond Athens. In the markets and streets of other Greek cities, his ideas traveled with merchants and soldiers, teachers and travelers. Each person who had heard about the man who died for asking questions carried some part of his message to new places. In Rome, 300 years after Socrates' death, a wealthy lawyer named Cicero stood before the Roman Senate. He was arguing against the dictator Mark Antony, knowing that his words might cost him his life. As he spoke about duty and virtue, about the courage to speak truth to power, he drew inspiration from the example of Socrates. "A life without principles is not worth living," Cicero declared, echoing the words of the Athenian philosopher. "Better to die with honor than to live in shame." Like Socrates, Cicero would be killed for his refusal to remain silent when he saw injustice. But his writings would preserve Socratic ideas for future generations of Romans who had never heard of the original gadfly of Athens. In the same period, a slave named Epictetus taught other slaves about inner freedom. Though his body belonged to his master, his mind was his own. He had learned from Socratic teachings that no one could make a person truly unhappy without their consent, that virtue was the only real good, and that wisdom came from understanding what was within one's control and what was not. "You are not your circumstances," Epictetus would tell his fellow slaves. "You are your responses to your circumstances. This is where your freedom lies." Later, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius would write in his personal journal about the lessons he had learned from Socratic philosophy. Even the most powerful man in the world found wisdom in the teachings of a poor Athenian who had claimed to know nothing. Time moved forward, and the ideas of Socrates traveled with it. When Christianity began to spread through the Roman Empire, some early church fathers saw connections between Socratic teachings and their new faith. Both emphasized the importance of examining one's life, both valued truth above comfort, and both taught that worldly possessions were less important than the condition of one's soul. St. Augustine, writing in North Africa 400 years after Socrates' death, found inspiration in the philosopher's method of questioning. "The unexamined life is not worth living," Augustine wrote, "and the unexamined faith is not worth believing." As centuries passed, the ideas of Socrates seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker. During the Dark Ages in Europe, when learning was preserved mainly in monasteries, monks copied and recopied the works of Plato, keeping Socratic dialogue alive through difficult times. When the Renaissance arrived, bringing renewed interest in ancient learning, scholars rediscovered Socrates with excitement. Erasmus, the great humanist, wrote about learned ignorance. The Socratic idea that true wisdom begins with admitting what we do not know. Montaigne, the French essayist, adopted "What do I know?" as his personal motto, directly inspired by Socratic humility. The questioning method of Socrates proved especially valuable during the scientific revolution. When Galileo challenged the accepted beliefs about astronomy, when Newton questioned assumptions about motion and gravity, when other scientists began to examine the natural world with fresh eyes, they were following the Socratic principle of accepting nothing without investigation. Francis Bacon, often called the father of modern science, wrote that knowledge began with doubt. "If we begin with certainties, we shall end in doubts," he declared. "But if we begin with doubts and are patient with them, we shall end in certainties." This was pure Socratic thinking. Start by admitting ignorance. Ask careful questions, examine evidence thoughtfully, and build knowledge step by step on solid foundations. The ideas of Socrates traveled across oceans to the New World, when American colonists began to question the authority of kings and to insist on their right to govern themselves. They drew on philosophical traditions that traced back to ancient Athens. The men who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution had read Plato's accounts of Socrates and understood the importance of citizens who could think for themselves. Thomas Jefferson, writing about education, argued that democracy could only survive if people learned to examine their beliefs and question their leaders. "The price of freedom is eternal vigilance," he wrote, expressing a thoroughly Socratic idea in new words. During the Industrial Revolution, when traditional ways of life were changing rapidly, the Socratic method proved valuable for adapting to new circumstances. John Stuart Mill wrote about the importance of questioning social customs and moral beliefs. "The only way in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject," Mill argued, is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion. In the 20th century, as humanity faced unprecedented challenges, the influence of Socrates appeared in unexpected places. When Mahatma Gandhi led India's struggle for independence, he drew inspiration from Socratic teachings about the examined life and the courage to stand for truth against powerful opponents. Be the change you wish to see in the world, Gandhi taught, echoing the Socratic belief that virtue must begin with individual self-improvement. Martin Luther King Jr., fighting for civil rights in America, found strength in Socratic ideas about justice and the duty to disobey unjust laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Even in the field of psychology, the influence of Socrates appeared. Carl Rogers developed a method of therapy based on asking questions rather than giving answers, helping patients discover their own insights rather than telling them what to think. The Socratic method had found new life in helping people heal their minds and emotions. In classrooms around the world, teachers learned to use Socratic questioning to help students think more deeply. Instead of simply telling students what to believe, good teachers learned to ask questions that made students examine their assumptions and discover truth for themselves. As the 21st century began with its rapid technological changes and global challenges, the ideas of Socrates seemed more relevant than ever. In a world flooded with information, the Socratic emphasis on distinguishing between knowledge and mere opinion became crucial. In societies struggling with polarization and conflict, the Socratic commitment to civil dialogue and shared truth-seeking offered hope for better understanding. The old philosopher who had walked barefoot through the Agora of Athens, asking simple questions about virtue and wisdom, had become an eternal rebel against ignorance, prejudice, and unthinking acceptance of authority. His ideas had survived the fall of empires, the rise of new religions, and the transformation of human society from ancient to modern. Every time someone questioned a popular belief, examined their own assumptions, or had the courage to speak truth to power, the spirit of Socrates lived again. Every teacher who asked students to think rather than memorize. Every citizen who demanded accountability from leaders. Every person who chose principles over popularity was carrying forward the work that had begun in ancient Athens. The trial of Socrates had been intended to silence a troublesome questioner. Instead, it had created a symbol that would inspire countless generations of people to keep asking the questions that matter most. How should we live? What is justice? What is truth? How can we become better human beings? The answers to these questions might change with time and circumstances, but the questions themselves were eternal. As long as human beings faced moral choices and sought to understand their world, the example of Socrates would continue to guide them toward wisdom, courage, and truth. The eternal rebel had won the greatest victory possible. He had made his ideas immortal. In a bright classroom in modern Athens, a teacher stood before 30 teenagers, holding up her smartphone. The ancient agora was visible through the window, now surrounded by busy streets and modern buildings. But the marble columns still caught the morning sunlight just as they had 25 centuries ago. "How many of you checked social media this morning?" she asked. Nearly every hand went up. "And how many of you questioned whether the information you saw was true?" Only 3 hands remained raised. The teacher smiled. Way out of dangers today. Her name was Maria, and she taught philosophy in the same city where Socrates had once asked his troubling questions. Every day she watched her students navigate a world that would have amazed the ancient philosopher. They carried computers in their pockets that could access all human knowledge instantly. They could talk to friends on the other side of the world. They could watch events happening anywhere on Earth in real time. But for all their technological power, Maria's students faced the same fundamental challenges that had confronted people in Socrates' time. They struggled to tell truth from lies, to make good decisions, to understand right from wrong, and to figure out how to live meaningful lives. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living, Maria continued. But in our time, we might ask, is the over-informed life worth living? We have access to more information than any generation in history, but are we wiser? A student named Andreas raised his hand. Grandfather says people were happier when they knew less. Maybe too much information is bad for us. An interesting point, Maria replied, unconsciously echoing the Socratic method. But let me ask you this. Is happiness the same thing as wisdom? And if we had to choose between being happy and being wise, which would we pick? Another student, Sophia, spoke up. But why do we have to choose? Can't we be both happy and wise? Perhaps we can. But think about this. If you discovered that something you believed your whole life was false, would that make you happy? Yet would you want to continue believing the false thing just to stay comfortable? The students looked thoughtful. This was exactly the kind of question Socrates had asked in the same city 25 centuries earlier. Technology had changed everything about human life except the deepest questions about how to live well. Across the ocean in Silicon Valley, a software engineer named David was facing his own Socratic moment. He had been working for years on algorithms that determined what news stories people saw on social media. The company told him he was helping people get information that interested them. But lately, David had begun to question this. He noticed that the algorithms seemed to show people information that confirmed what they already believed, rather than challenging them to think in new ways. Instead of encouraging the kind of questioning that Socrates had promoted, the technology was creating echo chambers where people only heard opinions that matched their own. David remembered reading about Socrates in college. The ancient philosopher had insisted that real learning happened when people were forced to examine their beliefs and consider different viewpoints. But David's algorithms were doing the opposite, making it easier for people to avoid uncomfortable questions. Late one night in his office, David made a decision that would have made Socrates proud. He began writing code that would deliberately show users information that challenged their assumptions, that presented different perspectives on important issues, that asked hard questions instead of providing easy answers. His supervisors were not pleased. People don't want to be challenged, his boss told him. They want to be entertained and confirmed, so it keeps them using our platform. But what if we're making them less wise? David asked. What if we were actually making society worse by never forcing people to think critically about what they believe? It was a classic Socratic question, and like Socrates, David found himself in trouble for asking it. But he decided that some things were more important than job security. He continued his work on algorithms that would promote critical thinking rather than comfortable confirmation. Meanwhile, in a courthouse in Chicago, a lawyer named Jennifer was defending a whistleblower who had exposed corruption in a government agency. Her client had discovered that officials were taking bribes and covering up safety violations that put the public at risk. The prosecutor argued that the whistleblower should have stayed quiet and worked within the system to address problems. But Jennifer saw clear parallels to the trial of Socrates. 2,500 years ago, she told the jury, Athens put a man on trial for asking uncomfortable questions and challenging authority. They said he was corrupting the youth and undermining social order. Today, we put people on trial for exposing uncomfortable truths and challenging powerful institutions. My client, like Socrates, faced a choice between personal safety and moral duty. Like Socrates, she chose to speak truth, even when it was dangerous. Like Socrates, she believed that some things are more important than avoiding trouble. The jury found her client not guilty, but Jennifer knew the larger battle was far from over. Every generation had to decide whether it valued comfort or truth, whether it wanted citizens who asked questions or subjects who simply obeyed. In classrooms around the world, other teachers were discovering the continued relevance of Socratic methods. In Finland, students learned to evaluate information sources and question their own assumptions. In Singapore, children practiced asking why and how do you know, instead of just memorizing facts. In Brazil, philosophy teachers used Socratic dialogue to help students think about justice and equality, but they also faced resistance. Some parents complained that schools were teaching children to question too much, to challenge authority too often. Some politicians worried that critical thinking might make citizens harder to govern. Some religious leaders feared that philosophical questioning might undermine faith. These concerns were not new. They were the same fears that had led Athens to condemn Socrates. Every society had to wrestle with the tension between order and inquiry, between tradition and progress, between comfort and growth. In the digital age, these questions had become even more urgent. Artificial intelligence was beginning to make decisions that affected human lives. Genetic engineering was giving people the power to change the nature of life itself. Climate change was forcing humanity to make choices that would affect the entire planet. How could people make good decisions about such complex issues without the ability to ask hard questions? Examine evidence carefully and think beyond their immediate self-interest. How could democracy survive in an age of information overload and deliberate disinformation without citizens who could think critically about what they heard? The example of Socrates offered both hope and guidance. His method of careful questioning, his commitment to truth over comfort, his courage in standing up for principles even at great personal cost, all of these remained as relevant as ever around the world. People were rediscovering that wisdom was not about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions. They were learning that true strength came not from avoiding difficult truths, but from facing them honestly. They were finding that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons, but with ideas. In refugee camps, teachers used Socratic methods to help children process trauma and think about hope. In boardrooms, executives learned to question their assumptions about success and responsibility. In research laboratories, scientists practiced the kind of intellectual humility that Socrates had exemplified. The questions he had first asked in the Agora of ancient Athens echoed in new contexts. What is justice in an age of global inequality? What is courage in an era of climate crisis? What is wisdom when artificial intelligence can process information faster than human minds? What is the good life when technology can extend human lifespan, but not necessarily human meaning? As evening fell over modern Athens, Maria finished her philosophy class and walked through the ancient Agora, where Socrates had once questioned his fellow citizens. Tourists took pictures of the ruins, but she saw something different. She saw the birthplace of an idea that had refused to die, the idea that human beings have both the right and the responsibility to think for themselves. The trial of Socrates had ended 25 centuries ago, but in a deeper sense, it had never ended. Every day, in classrooms and courtrooms, in laboratories and homes, in the hearts and minds of people everywhere, the same fundamental question was being asked and answered. Will we choose the examined life or the unexamined life? Every person who chose to ask hard questions instead of accepting easy answers, who valued truth over comfort, who had the courage to speak up when they saw injustice, was casting their vote in the eternal trial of Socrates. The verdict was never final because each generation had to decide for itself whether wisdom was worth the trouble it caused, whether democracy could survive without citizens who thought critically, whether humanity could solve its greatest challenges without the willingness to question everything. At that sense, Socrates was not just a historical figure but a living question that each person had to answer. What kind of life will you choose to live? Will you examine your beliefs and actions, or will you simply follow what others tell you? Will you have the courage to seek truth even when it is uncomfortable, or will you choose the safety of unexamined assumptions? The answer to that question would determine not just individual destinies, but the future of human civilization itself. As long as people were willing to ask it, the spirit of Socrates would continue to walk among them, still teaching, still questioning, still challenging. Each new generation to choose wisdom over ignorance, courage over comfort, and truth over convenience. The gadfly of Athens had achieved a kind of immortality that no king or conqueror could claim. His questions would live as long as human beings cared about becoming better than they were, about understanding themselves and their world, about living lives worthy of the remarkable gift of consciousness they had been given. In the end, that was the true victory of Socrates. Not that he had all the answers, but that he had taught humanity to keep asking the questions that mattered most.